Hello, and welcome to today's Life Sciences revision lesson for grade 11s. Today we are going to be looking at the respiratory system and how gaseous exchange occurs. First of all, when you were little, you learned that respiratory system was all about breathing. But now that you're in high school, you need to know that there are different meanings to the terms breathing and respiration, and you need to understand that or else you're going to get very confused. So let's have a look at the different terms used for the processes, all of which work together to get oxygen to our cells. Okay, first process you've heard about before, that's respiration. And when we say just the word respiration, we are referring to cellular respiration, which is aerobic. In other words, it involves oxygen and it occurs in the mitochondria of the cells. So respiration is when the use of oxygen in the breakdown of food to release energy. That's what happens to the oxygen when it gets to the cells. The next term is gaseous exchange. And gaseous exchange is when oxygen is taken into your body and carbon dioxide is removed. So this is when the oxygen and carbon dioxide actually move from the air into the cells and back again. Then the third concept is breathing. And breathing is what you do when you take a deep breath. And that is when your rib cage and diaphragm force air in and out of your lungs. So breathing is the body movements forcing air in and out of the lungs. Please don't get confused between these three concepts. They all fit together. The first one is breathing, because you've got to breathe. Then in your lungs, gaseous exchange occurs and the oxygen ends up being used in respiration. Now, gaseous exchange always occurs by diffusion. So the oxygen has got to get into your body somehow, and it diffuses into your body, and it's got to diffuse through part of your body surface. And the part of your body where oxygen leaves the air and goes into your cells is called a respiratory surface or a gaseous exchange surface. And in humans, that is the alveoli in our lungs. But different animals have different respiratory surfaces, and we're just going to have a quick look at some of those. First of all, an amoeba, which you've heard of before. Amoeba simply takes in oxygen through its thin cell membrane, doesn't have any special organs. An earthworm also doesn't have lungs or any special organs. Oxygen simply diffuses through its moist skin. But as an animal gets bigger and now lives on land, it can't have a moist skin. So animals, when they live in water, they develop things called gills, which absorb oxygen from the water. Then land animals, which is at the bottom here, there are two different ways they can get in oxygen, and one is by having a series of air tubes taking the oxygen directly to the cells. Those are the trachea, or like us, having special organs called lungs. But wherever that surface is found, that is where the oxygen actually goes into the body of the animal. Now, what must the surface be like so that oxygen can pass through it? For example, our skin is designed to protect us, so we can't breathe through our skin. So we breathe through our lungs. whereas an earthworm can breathe through its skin. What is the difference? What must a surface be like so that it can actually do a good job of taking in oxygen? So these are the requirements for a gaseous exchange surface. First of all, the lining's got to be thin, so there's a short distance for the gas to diffuse. The lining of our lungs is thin. It's got to have a large surface area, because the more surface area, the quicker the gas gets absorbed. So that's for maximum absorption. And did you know that if you took the surface area of your lungs and flattened out those alveoli, it covers the surface of a tennis court. And that's all packed inside your body. Then the surface must be moist so that oxygen can dissolve, so that it can diffuse. There need to be many blood vessels close by to transport the gas away quickly, because remember, diffusion stops when concentrations are equal. So if you take the oxygen away, you always keep up a concentration difference. Then you've got to get the air into your lungs, and that's ventilation or breathing. And lastly, our air passages need to be strengthened, because actually there's nothing in them but air. So they would collapse if they weren't strengthened. So all of the animals that we looked at, they have all of these particular characteristics for their gaseous exchange surface, whether it's skin or gills or lungs. Now, let's have a look at us. In class, you probably looked at the structure of the respiratory system, where air goes into the nose, travels down through the trachea, into the bronchus, into the bronchioles, and eventually ending up in the alveoli. And you need to be able to identify all of these organisms and say what happens to the air inside each one of these organs. Let's have a brief look at what happens. First of all, we have the nasal passages, and the nasal passages are clean and warm and moisten the air, so when it gets to the lungs, it's nice and moist. So the air goes in there. Then it goes through your pharynx, and at the bottom of the pharynx, two passages separate. There's the esophagus and the larynx, or the air passages. Now, when you swallow, you don't want food to go down into your larynx here, because it would block your larynx and you wouldn't be able to breathe. So there is a flap of cartilage here called the epiglottis, and when you swallow, the epiglottis closes off the air passages so that you don't choke. If you try and talk when you have only just finished swallowing, you will often find you're opening your epiglottis a bit too soon, and some of the food does go down into your air passages, and that is when you cough and splutter. Then, when the air gets into the air passages, it travels down, first of all, the trachea, then it splits into a bronchus going to each lung, and those bronchi divide into smaller and smaller air passages, which are the bronchioles. To prevent them from collapse, they have cartilage rings or pieces of cartilage, and they also are lined by cilia and a layer of mucus to try and trap any particles of pollution or smoke or anything like that, so that it doesn't get stuck in your lungs. Because once it's stuck in the alveoli, you can't get it out. If the smoke gets stuck here on the side of your trachea, there are cilia which can actually push it out and you can cough it up. Then the air ends up in these little things here, which look like a bunch of grapes. Okay, and those are the alveoli at the end of the bronchioles. And the alveoli have got a folded surface so that it enlarges the surface area. Remember, to absorb more oxygen so that the oxygen can diffuse through quickly. It's lined by a single layer of flattened cells or squamous epithelium so that the gas moves through easily. The lining is moist so that the gas can dissolve. And you can see here, surrounded by blue and red things, which are your blood vessels, taking blood to and from the alveoli. Let's have a look at what actually happens inside each alveolus. Okay, so this picture is one of those alveoli where gaseous exchange occurs, and gaseous exchange always occurs by diffusion. And remember, diffusion is the movement from a high concentration to a low concentration. Now, the air you breathe in, you can see here, the air you breathe in has got about 20% oxygen in it. The air you breathe in has got a very low percentage of carbon dioxide, less than 1%. So the air you breathe in is quite high in oxygen. So here there is a high concentration, and the red arrows show that the oxygen is moving from the air into the blood. And if we have a look at what's happening here, look at the color of those red blood cells. They are changing, or they are shown to be changing to a red color, meaning they are oxygenated. They've got a lot of oxygen inside them. And that's another term you need to know. What does oxygenated mean? It's blood with lots and lots of oxygen. If we look at the blood that's coming in here, now this blood has been around the body. It's lost its oxygen and it's full of carbon dioxide. So this blood would be deoxygenated blood, meaning it's full of carbon dioxide, and we show that as little blue red blood cells. And what's happening to the blue as the blood flows past the alveolus? The blue is disappearing, which means that that carbon dioxide is moving from a high concentration in the blood to a low concentration in the alveoli, and then you can breathe out. But maybe we need to take a break, and you can take some deep breaths in and out and think about what's happening in your lungs as you do so. See you just now. Hello and welcome back. I hope during your break you took some deep breaths and thought about the air passing through all those parts of the respiratory system and ending up in your alveoli in your lungs. At the end of the last section, we're looking at this picture, which is showing in the red arrows how oxygen diffuses into the blood, and blue was showing how carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood. In other words, the blood that came into the alveoli is deoxygenated blood, and the blood going here to the pulmonary vein is oxygenated blood. Okay, and you do need to know the difference between those terms. So, what happens next? The blood has picked up the oxygen and it is now going out of the lungs. What we're going to look at now is, well, in the blood, how is the gas carried? So how is the gas transported in the blood? And oxygen is transported in the red blood cells combined with a pigment called hemoglobin. And when that hemoglobin carries oxygen, it is called oxyhemoglobin, and it's a bright red color. So if you cut open an artery, the blood coming out of your artery would be a bright scarlet color because of this oxyhemoglobin. Okay, so that's here. These are the oxygen. Okay, so that's the lungs, and that's the oxygen atoms which go into the red blood cells. They go off to the organs and take the oxygen to the organs. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, is usually dissolved in the plasma, and only a small amount of it is joined to hemoglobin. And when carbon dioxide dissolves in the plasma, it forms a bit of carbonic acid, which changes the pH of the blood, and we'll see more about the significance of that a little bit later. So the gases are now in the blood, and they're going off to the cells. So now we get to the tissues where gaseous exchange occurs again. There's 2 points where gaseous exchange occurs: when it goes from the air into the blood in the lungs, and in the tissues when it goes from the blood, and you can see here the arrow is showing the oxygen leaving the blood vessel and entering these things, which are the cells in your body. Okay, so the oxygen leaves the hemoglobin and moves out of the blood into the cells, and very often questions on this are linked to, well, what happens to the oxygen after it's in the cells? And there are often links between gaseous exchange here and cellular respiration, which is happening inside the cells to give them energy. Remember, this is by diffusion, so it's all from a high concentration in the blood to a low concentration in the tissues. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, a lot of it has been produced in the tissues. So there's a high concentration of carbon dioxide, and that is why the carbon dioxide then moves out of the cells into the blood, because there's a much lower concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood. And the blood vessel, the blood keeps flowing, and the carbon dioxide is taken away in the blood, and fresh blood with oxygen is brought past the cells. Now, that's what happens in your cells. Next thing we're looking at is, well, what does our body do to ensure that oxygen goes into our lungs? Okay, and that is called ventilation, or we can call it the mechanism of breathing. In other words, what is happening inside your body to make sure that you get enough oxygen to your body. Okay, first of all, the mechanism breathing is breathing movements, and these are caused by contraction of the diaphragm. And remember from your studying of the different parts of the respiratory system, here at the bottom, separating the thoracic and the abdominal cavity is a muscle called the diaphragm. And that, when it contracts, it moves downwards. The other muscles are the intercostal muscles, which are between the ribs, and when they contract, they move the rib cage upwards and outwards. So let's have a look at what happens when you breathe in, and breathing in is called inhalation. And inhalation is an active process because it means your muscles have to work, and the diaphragm contracts and moves down, and the intercostal muscles contract, and the rib cage moves upwards and outwards. And what that does is it increases the space the volume of the chest or thoracic cavity, and that lowers the pressure inside, and that causes gases to rush into the lungs. Let's have a look at the other process. Exhalation, which is breathing out, and exhalation is a passive process. So after you've breathed in, when you breathe out, all the muscles relax. And when the diaphragm relaxes, it moves upwards here. And when the intercostal muscles relax, the rib cage moves downwards and inwards. And that makes this space or this volume inside the lungs, it makes it much smaller. So the molecules are under pressure, the air molecules in the lungs are under pressure, and they are then pushed out so that you exhale. Now, let's look at both of these together so you can see the difference. Okay, so first of all, we have this one, which is inhalation, with the diaphragm moving down and the rib cage moving up and out as the muscles contract. This picture shows exhalation, and you can see that the diaphragm, which is normally a dome shape, you can see that the diaphragm has definitely moved upwards here. You can also see that the rib cage, if you look here at the size of the rib cage, okay, you can definitely see that there is a difference. So the rib cage is now smaller, and then again here, the volume of the chest cavity is very, very different. Here, the air moves in, and here, the air is pushed out. And we do that many times a minute from the time we are born till the time we die. Now, when you do exercise, let's say you go running or you play sport, you find you are breathing much, much faster. Why? How does your body know that you need to breathe faster so you can get in more oxygen? Because your cells are going to need oxygen to release the energy for you playing the sport. How does this actually work? Okay, this is something called homeostasis, which, if you listen to any of the previous sessions, is when your body tries to keep the right amount of each different substance in your blood to keep your cells alive. So that's homeostasis. Now, if you are doing vigorous exercise, you are going to have less oxygen in your blood and more carbon dioxide. Now, one would think that it's the oxygen level which is crucial, but it's actually not. What makes you breathe faster is an increase in the carbon dioxide level in your blood. And in the blood vessels at the base of your neck, the carotid arteries, just at the base of your neck, there are special sensors which can sense the carbon dioxide concentration, and if it's too high, does something about it. So these are sensors in the carotid artery, sense an increase in the CO2 level, send a message off to the brain, and in the brain there's a breathing control center, and that part of the brain then sends a message to the rib cage and to the diaphragm to increase the breathing rate. So that is why you breathe faster when you are doing exercise. Unfortunately, I don't think we've got time for this to have a look at this picture, but it's simply a flow diagram showing how this homeostasis or control of the level of gases in the blood actually works. I hope this has helped your understanding. See you next time.